Hello, everyone. We are back with a new episode of Made You Think for the first time in a while. Thank you all for being patient. If this is your first episode, then disregard anything about having to wait. I'm glad you're here. Like I mentioned in the update episode a bit over a week ago, we are doing things a little bit differently for now. So this is Nat, and I've been here for all the past episodes. We have a new guest with us today. This is
Mansal
what's the last name?
Denton.
And
Don't look that up.
we might come back to that later. But I invited Mansal to join for the episode today because the book we're discussing is Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna, which covers humanity's relationship with psychedelics and plant medicine throughout history. And of pretty much everyone I know, Mansal knows the most about this area and actually works in this area in sort of an indirect way right now. So we're excited to talk about the book today.
I'm very excited. Anything psychedelics related, whether it's talking about them or doing them, is great.
Yeah, I'm sure we're going to have a lot of user stories from both of us, I think, as the episode goes on. But before we dig in, Mansal, you want to just give everyone a little background on you and what you're up to?
Sure, yeah. So I have recently left an organization called Nutripedia, where my whole focus was helping people to optimize their mental performance using nootropics. I found that some of the best nootropics were psychedelics, and from that path, I've kind of moved into another organization called ayahuasca, which is a lifestyle brand around reharmonizing people to the natural world. And so to give you a very high level view of what I'm interested right now, I believe that all of the external problems in the world are a manifestation of what's going on in our minds collectively as a society. And so the way to solve what's going on in our minds, well, there are many, but psychedelics can be a powerful tool, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so compelled by them right now.
I should mention too that Mansal actually took me on my first hunt sort of through ayahuasca as you were testing out that model, right? And you're actually going to be doing more of those.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Like I mentioned, I think the transformational experiences, these peak experiences, are things that we all kind of crave, and they help to change our perspective in some way. And hunting, for me anyway, has been a transformative experience. And I hope as well for you and anyone else who comes on the trips.
No, I would recommend. I mean, even if you don't do it with ayahuasca or with Mansal, if you have an opportunity to do kind of an introductory guided hunt, it's a very cool experience. I'm very glad that I did it, and you had a really great operation for that, so that was fun.
Well, I'm glad you liked it, and yeah, I want as many people as possible to go on the hunt. So I will be having an entire ethical hunting series coming up, which is just basically emails for people how to get started. Doesn't have to be through my hunts, but if people want to start on their own, because I know a lot of people, especially people listening to this, probably are in cities, have no idea where to start. And so I created a whole kind of outline for people to figure that out and go do it themselves if they want.
Sweet. Well, when you have that ready, send it to me, and I'll put it in the medley. Or it's not going to be ready like next week, right?
No.
Okay.
That's why I didn't have any URL on the top of my head.
All right. Well, when it's ready, I'll put it in my newsletter. But yes, so obviously today we're talking about Food of the Gods. We're not talking about hunting. Maybe we'll do that another episode in the future. But it's an interesting time, I think, to be talking about this, because it does feel in the last year like a threshold has been crossed in the public mind around psychedelics and plant medicines. I think Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, probably had one of the biggest influences in that societal shift, plus all of the research that we're seeing coming out now supporting things like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, or even MDMA for PTSD and other psychiatric therapies. All right. Does it feel the same to you? Like we're kind of in this transitional mode right now where people are suddenly more okay with it? Or talking about it?
I do think it's becoming way more mainstream and acceptable, and it's hard to judge what the reality is because I've been in this world for a while. I tend to put myself around other like-minded, open-minded people. So, what that actually looks like on the rest of society, I don't know. But I do think, especially with people like Michael Pollan's, he's a source of integrity for a lot of people, and people who have read his other books have a lot of respect for him. So I think that's a really big shift in the right direction. And yeah, like you said, people who are only focusing on the science are going to be interested in a lot of these studies.
And I think Denver, I want to say, is even looking at legalizing psilocybin.
Portland.
Or Portland? Okay.
Portland, yeah.
If they do that, that's going to be so amazing for tourism.
It will. I'd be curious to see what happens with that.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about the psychedelics specifically that is so compelling given where we are in the current political climate is that it's very hard for people to argue on either side of the aisle with some of the things that are coming out within the space of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Because, conservatives love the military, and how are you going to justify denying someone with PTSD who served for our country something that can help them? And if psychedelics are the one thing that we can all agree on, then I'm a happy person.
I think there's a lot of people too who could use a heavy dose of psychedelics to stop, like being angry, shitty people too. I don't know if that's a legitimate prescription we can give, but it does feel sometimes like, I don't know, being wrapped up in the news cycle or in the outrage cycle, right? And we're going to talk about this more in the book, but there is something to the stepping outside of yourself and kind of even of reality that comes with these types of experiences that I think is getting even more useful in a culture that's becoming even more obsessed with the day-to-day and itself, and this other kind of imaginary world, which is everything in the internet, right? Like that realm of reality doesn't really exist in any physical way. Neither does the like reality you can explore within your head. And it's kind of like recreating that relationship with the internal map, I think, is something that pretty much everyone can benefit from. And it's probably what we're seeing with meditation and its rise in popularity as well, right? There's like a recognition of something lost. And I think that's sort of what Terence McKenna is starting or trying to explore in this book.
Yeah, I think if you look at what we value as a society, it's achievement, success, etc., that often lends itself to use of stimulants. And there's a feedback loop that rewards that, whereas it takes a type of person and it takes a lot of momentum, I think, to get a person to psychedelics. So I could introduce Mr. Trump to some psychedelic, but he might not be open to it in the same way that he might be to coffee, for example, right? I mean, it's obviously those are very different things, but I think it's kind of what we value that's starting to shift a little bit.
And we should probably mention, now that we've started to go down this rabbit hole a bit, obviously the things we're talking about are illegal in most places, and we're not obviously advocating law breaking or doing anything risky. And there are, of course, inherent risks with these chemicals, even if they do typically test as safe, especially compared to almost any other drug on the market. There are obviously always risks. There are legal considerations. So, be smart. Those guys on the podcast said I should do it does not hold up in court, so we cannot save you. But, we do want to talk about this and talk about it honestly and bring our experiences into it too. And, I think that it is something that by talking about it on air like this, we actually can, help push the discussion forward towards more acceptance and away from the old kind of like scared ideas that developed around these substances in the last, not like that long, like maybe 40, 50 years, right? It felt like everything got really positive in the 60s ish and then super negative. And now people in like our parents' generation have, I think, fairly negative stereotypes around a lot of these plant medicines, right? But that's like a unique thing within history. For most of history, it's been a fairly positive association, although maybe less so post-agriculture, right?
Yeah, I would say the kind of war on drugs and, Nixon claiming that Timothy Leary was the most dangerous man
in the world.
world. Those kinds of that hyperbole has kind of done it in injustice, psychedelics. But I'm pretty optimistic about things, given that people who were doing drugs in the 70s, the hippie generation starting to take over, and I can't imagine there are not politicians who have done some of these things. I mean,
Good point. Yeah.
increasingly will be a greater and greater number of them. So I don't think it's going away by any stretch.
Yeah. Well, and you said something interesting before about, what kinds of drugs people are comfortable taking and which ones they aren't. And it's easy to forget that a lot of things that are normal in our day-to-day are drugs too, right? Coffee is a drug, alcohol is a drug, tobacco is a drug, aspirin is a drug, right? It's a very imprecise word that we're using, but all of us use substances to alter our daily experience in different ways, right? Like that's been unchanged. It's just the opinions we have about the different substances that seems to like flux back and forth. And it's funny, I didn't really know about this that much before reading the book, but there are actually benefits to, well, I guess I did know this because of microdosing, but there are benefits to taking sub-threshold doses of even some of the harder psychedelics like DMT and psilocybin. And that was actually a big part of hunter-gatherer culture for a while, right? Like it was actually like a hunting stimulant.
Yeah, there's a lot of research. I mean, it even still to this day is used. They will give ayahuasca admixtures to dogs for more effective hunting.
Really?
Yeah, so today in the jungle.
But it's got to be is it a low dose or are the dogs like tripping?
It's low enough that they're still doing what they need to be doing and they're not rolling around like the jaguars who will just full on trip.
Yeah, they like go all in, right? They've got something in their stomach where they can process the raw plants where we can't. Is that right?
Probably the reverse. So
it's the reverse. Okay.
We have an enzyme that breaks down the DMT, and it's an monoamine oxidase.
Okay.
And so we need an inhibitor so that enzyme goes away, so that the DMT is active for us. And my supposition is that the jaguars probably just don't have that enzyme, or they've got it functioning in a different way.
Got it. Is that why you usually need to smoke DMT if you're getting pure DMT, or then like with ayahuasca, it needs to be in the special drink, right? Are those both ways to get around that digestive inhibitor breaking it down?
Smoking the DMT doesn't get around that. It just overloads the enzyme's ability to break it down. That's why the trip is so short. So you get like a 15 to 20 minute trip.
Yeah.
Whereas ayahuasca is with an admixture that suppresses the enzyme and allows the DMT to be active for longer, and you get these longer trips.
Got it. So what are they mixing it with to make ayahuasca? Do you know?
Well, the primary admixture is chacruna leaves.
Okay.
Chacruna leaves are relatively common with the ayahuasca vine, and that is, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit, but that's NN-DMT, the most common.
Okay.
And then there's another plant, I forget what the other plant is, that can be used where it actually creates 5-MeO-DMT in the ayahuasca. Much more rare to find that, but it sometimes happens.
Got it. But these are like these mixtures, they're just sort of with plants, right? That's why you've got people who are basically living pre-modernity in the jungle that know how to do this. So it's something that we've known how to do for a very long time.
Yes, there's very clear archaeological evidence that people were making ayahuasca thousands of years ago, up to 2,000 to 3,000 BC. So they knew how to do it long before quote unquote civilization was around. And they obviously learned a lot about living in their environment through it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because McKenna, in one of these first chapters, he leads with this hypothesis that these hallucinogenic compounds may have actually had an influence in our ability to self-reflect, right? That it's possible that through these, through ingesting these compounds and having these experiences, that actually might have been the catalyst for developing our own self-reflective abilities, because there is something, about taking a high dose of one of these psychedelics where it is an intensely self-reflective experience. I didn't feel this as much on DMT because, like you said, it was like so short and fast and intense that it was kind of like immediate ego death. There was no Nat. There really wasn't anything to bring back. But with LSD, it definitely felt that way, where it's a lot more of just like you exploring yourself in a very unique way that at least I had never really gotten from any other experience in my life. And that's kind of a interesting hypothesis that this could have been, how we first started to think about ourselves and the other, and kind of have that second layer of self-reference that makes human cognition unique to other animals.
Yeah, there's obviously many things that came to play at the same time. I like how you use the word hypothesis as opposed to what's commonly considered, within the purview of the stoned ape theory. But yeah, I at least for myself, I can see how that would be a possibility. And I do really appreciate these what if scenarios. And even Terence McKenna, if you listen to any of his lectures, was pretty clear. He was coming up with what if scenarios. He didn't have testable he didn't have ways to test his hypothesis. He had some pretty interesting research. We can't know, at least we don't know right now. But I'm not closed off to the idea that some of these things, like specifically, like you mentioned, being able to look outside of ourselves were possible.
Well, he's quite a bit more measured than his brother was, right? Dennis McKenna was kind of a lot stronger in all of these assertions, right? Or is that reverse?
Yeah. So Dennis is the one who's alive, who's the actual scientist.
I've got him mixed up.
Terence is the one who passed away. Yeah, you're right. But Dennis does even joke about some of the things that Terence says. He's just kind of like, I don't know where he got that.
Well, it's better than who was it? The Harvard researcher who ended up running away into the woods. Was that Timothy Leary?
Leary, and then I forget what his Albert Ramdas,
Hoffman?
I believe. No, that's
Hoffman's the guy who discovered
Albert Hoffman is the one who discovered LSD, and he actually synthesized psilocybin as well before that. Cool. But yeah, there was another who worked with Leary, Ramdas.
Okay,
that's who Ramdas is now. I mean, I don't remember what his real name is, but yeah, they ran away for multiple reasons, I would say.
Oh yeah, okay. There was probably some other legal considerations, but building off of that kind of stoned ape theory, I mean, what do you think about this idea that the brain is primarily a filtering tool? Right. I think this is something Huxley talked about in The Doors of Perception, right? That the function of the brain might not be to understand our environment, but to filter out all of the less important noise and thoughts. And like consciousness is largely a subtractive process, not an additive. And so there is some argument that what these substances are doing are just kind of like lowering the floodgates of your experience to open your senses to everything that is going on in your environment that you're normally unaware of. And I think there is some element of, you might be walking and then you stop and there's a tree and the tree is just so beautiful, right? And you've never had this experience looking at a tree before. And if we felt that way about every tree we walked by, we would be dead very quickly, right? It'd be hard to function. And so it is kind of compelling, but how do you think about that? Do you think about it as like these are doing something, right, back there that's kind of like changing your perception? Or is it this element of like just sort of opening your eyes and mind to what's already there?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of both. I do really appreciate that perspective of lowering kind of the floodgates and having a lot more stimuli come in. I mean, that's just true. There's things that come in when you're doing any kind of psychedelic that, just like you mentioned, the tree is a classic example. But even in sober life, you can look at examples of, some specific book that you've never heard of, and then within a week you hear about it like 3 times. There's some part of your brain that is now receptive to that specific thing, and it's just picking it up more. So yeah, I'm a firm believer that there's some component of that, but then I think there's also some component of, projecting things onto the environment. So there are certain aspects of your psyche, etc., that become physical realities in the external world on something like a large dose of psychedelics that make it it's a process with the environment that's kind of going back and forth. It's almost like it's providing some things to you in a stimuli sense, and you're providing some projections into the environment in a way. But it also reminds me of some really interesting research around the part of the brain that is specifically designated to like truth making and like finding logic and truth in certain aspects of life are actually developed more with the intention of how can I create truth that I can describe to others so that they believe me, not necessarily objective truth. So even our truth seeking mechanisms in our brain are more inclined towards truth that serves me in a social setting,
right,
which humans are incredibly social animals, as opposed to actual objective truth. So even in mentally conceptualizing what I'm talking right now, I feel like I'm on psychedelics.
Well, so then I guess to what you're saying, it's like our brain might not be accurately interpreting reality. It's interpreting reality in the most useful way socially.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
That's part of it. And then part of it, I think, is also, just like you said, there's an element of stimuli that's being recorded and acknowledged that wouldn't be in your normal waking consciousness.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting too, because that might explain some of why animals seem interested in psychedelics, at least, right? Because that's always been a question to me, where for us, it's attractive in the self-reflective way, right? And it's useful in the self-reflective way. But as far as we know, animals don't really have a capacity for self-reflection, right? So why would a jaguar want to, trip balls on DMT? Like, have you ever thought about what might be attractive there to the animals, or is it just like a biological urge we all have to change our state?
There was actually some pretty compelling research on the topic. One, just like you said, there's some element of completely pressing reset on our consciousness that almost every species can benefit from. So it's actually an evolutionary disadvantage for an animal to be tripping, very open for predators to kill them at that time. But what happens is, like, all animals have habitual patterns, and sometimes these patterns are helpful and sometimes they're not. And what the science showed was that having these pattern interrupts allowed for the animals to change habits that proved more evolutionarily advantageous.
Interesting. So it's almost like cleaning house on your internal processes a little bit, and then letting the effective ones come back and keeping out some of the bad ones. Yeah. It kind of sounds like cleaning out your computer, maybe, would be an acceptable analogy.
It does, right? Yeah. And reset is a term that's often used for computers. So I think the important caveat to that is animals know not to take that kind of stuff too frequently, generally speaking. And if you look at even the studies on addictiveness with animal models, rats, mice, etc., will take LSD and they don't go back to it.
Yeah.
Whereas cocaine, they'll just keep going back to it,
right.
Because that's like a reward pathway. Whereas with a psychedelic, it's quite a different effect.
Well, it's almost anti-addictive, because not only do you not want to go right back there right away, but it also doesn't work as well if you do it too frequently, right? Like, isn't there something where if you try to take LSD 2 days in a row, it basically doesn't do anything?
It won't do anything.
Yeah.
And the higher the dose, the more tolerant you become.
The longer you have to wait.
So you could do micro doses, under like even 0.2 grams, for example, of psilocybin.
Oh,
You can
psilocybin. I was going to say 0.2 grams of LSD is.
you could do like 0.2 grams as kind of a microdose, and you can do those multiple days in a row, and you might not necessarily have a subjective experience, but there's neurogenesis benefits that are coming, etc. But if you do a big dose, you better wait till the next week. And honestly, if you do a big enough dose, I don't know why why one would feel compelled to do it every week anyway.
Yeah. I mean, what I usually hear is like the annual cleanse, right? Like that seems to be I don't know, to me that always seemed like a good minimum effective dose for like self-administered psychedelic therapy, maybe quarterly too, depending on the amount you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean,
I fall more on the liberal
side.
The liberal side, but here's the distinction that I will make. I think that it can be like psychedelics can be incredibly powerful tools, and then they could also be, and don't take this the wrong way, I don't necessarily advocate or even do them I don't particularly like them being coupled together with like party drugs necessarily.
Yeah.
But I do find a lot of value in spending time during the day with a group of 5 friends and just doing small doses throughout the day, finding that appreciation for the natural environment that I'm in on a more regular basis. So if you want to call that recreational use, sure, recreational use. I appreciate that maybe more frequently. The big doses, I think, have a ton of value. But I think where a lot of the value comes with these psychedelic compounds is the structure that's placed around them. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of doing like an ayahuasca ceremony or retreat where there are multiple ceremonies within a week. And I found like those experiences, if you want to do them annually, I think that, that's probably a good timeline for those kinds of like deep internal reflections.
Yeah.
Those provide the major like catalysts. Those provide my relationship's like unhealthy, I need to leave. Oh, this job is not what I want, I need to leave. So very different. And of course it's talked about with the whole set and setting component. So
well, I like the distinction you made too, is that when we're talking about doing psychedelics, we're not talking about dropping acid and going to a rave, right? It's much more of maybe you and one person helping facilitate the experience, or you're on a retreat, or you're with a small group of friends, or you're even alone, right? Like, I think there's a stigma, and McKenna talks about this in the book too. There's a stigma against doing drugs alone, right? Or doing substances alone, where that's, a categorically bad or even sad thing. But I don't know. I mean, I've found a lot of value in doing psychedelics alone and just like being with yourself, right? I think that can be a very useful experience as well. A scary one too at times, but like that's almost part of the value, right? And that's a very different relationship with a substance than like taking a bunch of Molly and going to an EDM concert, right? We're talking much more about the respectful use in productive settings and less the kind of like party drug version.
Sure. Yeah, I think when it comes to doing psychedelics on your own, there's a very different and in some ways more valuable experience that can come from that, because oftentimes if I'm with somebody, the ideas kind of come from all over the place, and it's very hard to have like real coherent conversations when you're in the climax of an experience like that. But what tends to happen is I'll go down kind of a rabbit hole of my own thoughts, and then I'll be brought back to the surface by something that somebody else does or says.
Yeah.
By myself, I can just go straight down. And so, you can go straight down to negative place,
right?
And
for better or worse.
You can go straight down to some deep thing that you feel compelled to, explore on your own. Also, I think that as much as I don't particularly have much interest in going to concert, like a rave and doing LSD or something like that, I don't see that as necessarily being a bad thing. I am a far bigger believer in people having the freedom to, do whatever they want and enjoy however they want. The most important thing for me would be to identify what's the intention. Is the intention to escape And I think that probably manifests more in combining alcohol, LSD, etc. in a party environment, or is the, intention to explore, reflect, connect. So I would say always look more to the intention necessarily than the external environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. The intention is a big aspect of it. And it seems like that's part of, or it's kind of like part of what has allowed certain drugs to like remain legal versus ones that haven't been. Because if you can escape from work with alcohol, right, in kind of a casual way that won't change your relationship with work, or like you can get really drunk after work, right? But it's not going to necessarily change how you think about life and work and everything. But if people were doing like acid on the regular, right, or LS or DMT or whatever, it would be, I think you'd have more of these experiences of like, oh, I don't like what I'm doing. It's harder to be locked into a monotonous routine that you hate if you're having these psychedelic driven wake ups every few months. And I feel like, and McKenna mentioned this too, that the drugs that are illegal and that we do consume, coffee, sugar, tobacco, alcohol, they all fit into what he calls this like dominator culture, right? This very capitalist, profit and work driven environment where it's considered kind of unacceptable to just sit around and explore the planes of human thought, for better or worse. But it's kind of interesting to see or to think about, how would our work and life and environment be changed if people did have access to these supplements, or to these, not supplements, but to these substances, and being able to explore that. And we're seeing it a little bit now with marijuana, I think, becoming legalized. We'll probably see that nationally legal in the next few years. It feels like we're just like on the cusp of that. And it hasn't, unraveled society, right? So it feels like that whole hypothesis has not been played out, that these things are dangerous and they'll destroy our environment, or they'll destroy like our successful society.
Sure. I think that's comes back to the intention. Is like you could have somebody who can just sit around, smoke weed all day and do nothing, which is the stereotype that anti-cannabis people often hold up. And you can have somebody who utilizes it to be more creative or whatever. Intentions, such an important thing. And kind of like you mentioned though, with those class of drugs, he said dominator culture.
Yeah, like dominator culture drugs.
It's interesting that stimulants obviously often fall in that category.
Right.
But even alcohol, that's a depressant, falls in that category. Maybe you can do certain tasks better when you have alcohol, reduce anxiety or something. But generally speaking, that's such a fine line. People are far beyond that when they're using alcohol.
Yeah.
So what comes to mind for me is a lot of these compounds create some type of baseline that's manageable. Whether it's coffee, like I've got enough stimulation where things are manageable. Okay, I'm good.
Oh yeah.
Alcohol, all right, things are manageable. Nicotine, kind of same way. Whereas, like you said, psychedelics are peak experiences, and it just blows through that, monotony.
Yeah.
And I actually think that there's so much value in doing both. I think that having the peak experiences on a regular enough basis where you can find, for lack of a better term, find your true north, come into alignment with what it is you want to create or whatever, and then use caffeine and nicotine and all these other compounds on a daily basis to quote unquote manifest it or do it.
Well, nicotine is actually a funny one because nicotine itself is not a very dangerous chemical. It's fairly harmless. It seems to be just every way we have of getting it is not great for us. It's like cigarettes, obviously, it's all the other shit in there really that's pretty bad for you. I mean, if you're smoking pure tobacco leaf infrequently, that's probably totally safe. How do you think about all of the vaporizers though?
I don't particularly like vapes at all. I just don't like anything that has an administration method that involves smoking at all. It's also a very intense administration method. So when you vape or smoke something, it's basically the same as sublingual, like under your tongue, as far as entering the mucous membranes, but it's just far larger surface area on the lungs. Okay. And so that's why you get the hit and it lasts less time and it's more intense. And that's one reason why smoking has such appeal, because it's like a really intense amount of nicotine really quickly.
Really quick. And you got to keep doing it.
Right. And one of the interesting things is nicotine, as far as addictiveness is concerned, nicotine is only addictive when it's combined with an MAOI, and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Tobacco is an MAOI, and so you have nicotine with this MAOI, which makes it addictive for humans. Nicotine by itself is not in scientific setting. And so if somebody were to utilize, well, first of all, if someone were to just smoke loose leaf tobacco and enjoy it like they might enjoy a glass of wine or a cigar, then I think there's probably more psychological value in enjoying it.
Yeah.
But if you're looking to just, utilize the chemical compound, nicotine is great. I've got a cabinet full of nicotine gum, and I just break
for focus. Yeah.
I'll break the gum into quarters. So I take about 0.5 milligrams.
Okay.
Of a 2 milligram piece of gum, and it works well, works long time versus smoking or vaping,
right, which is quick.
Yeah.
But then you've got all of these kids getting hooked on like Juul, right? Which is, or with vaporizers, right? Which is the pure nicotine. There's no MAOI inhibitor there as far as I know. Is there one in those cartridges that would be allowing it to become addictive? Because it's clearly really addictive if people are getting hooked on these vapes, right? So do you have any idea where that's coming from then?
I don't know where that would be coming from. I don't even know of the addiction of the vapes. Like I said, it's really quick administration method, and it obviously does impact reward centers in the brain. So,
it could be behavioral too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Is alcohol an MAOI inhibitor?
No.
No? Okay.
I've
heard that term thrown around before.
It's mostly thrown around when it comes to ayahuasca.
Is that what it is?
It's also thrown around sometimes when it comes to pharmaceutical drugs, but primarily I'm going to make a judgment or reach out a little bit on a limb, but I think it's probably in the context of ayahuasca where it becomes most applicable, because you can take the ayahuasca vine by itself and experience nothing. You need an MAOI inhibitor. Yeah.
Huh.
And some people, like, Hamilton from Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, he'll do all kinds of crazy stuff. He does like Vice mini documentaries on different psychedelics and stuff, and he'll use, MAOI inhibitors that are like just chemical compounds. Like he's like, I don't need the admixture from these plants. I'm just going to use the prescription drug alongside the ayahuasca.
Does that work?
Yeah, it totally works.
Huh. It's kind of cool. It's like a good way to test the theory that that's what the vine is doing.
Sure, yeah. I think that's at this point pretty clear, but I think you lose a lot when you remove it from the ceremonial or the historical context. I think you lose a lot more than people consider.
Well, I feel like that's true with so many natural things, right? Where if you, it's like Soylent, right? When you try to just reduce food to these few variables that we have a fairly shaky understanding of, and then remanufacture food from the ground up, you're going to lose something in that process. And we don't know what it is, but we will find out at some point, right? Like the consequences of doing that.
Yeah, that seems to me almost to be a symptom. This is kind of a tangent, but kind of a symptom of how people seem to believe science and rationality is the new God.
Yeah.
And we trust that with everything we've got. And Soylent seems to be a silly symptom of that.
Yeah. Well, there is this weird thing where science is great, right? And science does discover a lot of things, but it also is not complete, and it also gets things wrong, right? And that doesn't mean that it's bad and we shouldn't trust it, but it does mean that you should be like healthily skeptical, right? If, some new drug comes out that cures this disease and says it has no side effects, right? It's like probably that we just haven't seen what the side effects are yet, right? It's like basically every action in the body is going to have some reaction, right? Like no drugs are really a free lunch. And it's just like when you think that something is completely figured out in a closed case in science, it always seems like something else comes in. And so I don't know, the stuff like Soylent scares me because a lot of people drink it thinking it's healthy, and it's like we don't really know what you're doing to yourself yet. And obviously we've seen that a lot with like the whole opiate epidemic, right? It was like, oh, this will be a much better thing for, relieving pain than giving you morphine or than, whatever we had before. But it's like the biggest health crisis that we've like maybe ever had, aside from, something like polio, right? It's like the biggest manufactured health crisis ever. I think the stats now are that you're more likely to die of an opiate overdose than a car crash. It's like the number one source of accidental death now. And that's kind of another perfect example of what we're talking about here, where drugs that you can do while going to work are okay, but drugs where you would have to relax and like process aren't okay. Right? Like I feel like that's always been one of the pushbacks against marijuana, is that it makes you just want to chill, right? It's not good if everyone just wants to chill instead of work, right? Like that was part of the initial racism, fueled distrust of marijuana, right? Like the marijuana branding. We talked about this a lot in our smoke signals episode, if you go back in the archives, but we use the term marijuana now because it was a way to associate using it with Mexican laborers who would like get high and then not work. And then there was like all this horrible propaganda against like Mexicans and blacks getting high and attacking people. It's just like, it's so easy to build these like really bad reputations around these substances, but there is that element of like, yeah, if you can't work on it, then society's not going to allow it.
I also think, and this is maybe the pessimist or even the conspiracy theorist in me, but I think that at a structural level, like power centers are going to be fundamentally okay with compounds that allow us to do more work or allow us to just kind of cope with whatever challenges we're having on a day-to-day basis. And they're going to be less interested in us having completely radically shifted mindsets and perspectives on things. And especially things like psychedelics, where empathy is so heightened and you start to feel this sense of protection for the earth. And even Michael Pollan talks about how like the modern environmental movement came predominantly out of psychedelic experiences in the 60s and 70s. And it doesn't take much to see how that's actually the case. In the 70s, that's what was, had the most resistance from the administration. Mm-hmm. So it's a little more of a sinister view, but yeah, I think that it's applicable.
No, you can see it, right? Like we're already kind of having those issues, I think, with young men not being able to find work and just sitting at home playing video games, right? Like it's not completely crazy to imagine that if they had access to mind-altering substances, that there'd be some inclination to sit around and do that instead of go out and get a job. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is hard to support yourself long-term with that mentality. But I think that what we are seeing with going back to the opiate stuff, it's like it can literally cure those addictions. Right. And I think they've seen that get played out. Is it ibogaine?
Yeah.
That's the one where it's like you give people one ibogaine, but it's like a 2-day experience, right? It lasts a while.
Yeah. It's a very long experience as far as the psychoactive component's concerned. Mm-hmm. Requires a decent amount of integration as well because it's very physically challenging.
Okay.
And these kind of big doses of ibogaine definitely has a lot of power over like opiates and opiate addiction and stuff.
It can like cure alcoholism in basically one go, right? That's what I've heard.
And ayahuasca has similar effects, though generally less lauded and perhaps less statistically significant than iboga. But iboga is one of those things that it's suggested oftentimes and provided to people in very large mega doses. But, 1 out of 300 people actually has a heart condition that's too weak to handle iboga and they die. So that's like one of the ones where you can die if you take high doses. The thing is, though, there's so many great applications of iboga on smaller scale, threshold scale, even microdosing scale. So smaller scale use of iboga can be really powerful, even for addiction. In a safer way than something that might be overwhelming for the heart. So I think you're going to start to see more clinics coming online or more education about using iboga in a more smaller dose.
You don't hear about that one as much. Do you know what people have to do to do it? Because ayahuasca, I mean, you can even do that in the US if you find a shaman, right? Or you go to Peru, right? Or most people, if they go in the right direction, they can find LSD or mushrooms or something. But iboga doesn't seem like something you want to mess around with on your own.
That's why. Yeah. It's not something you want to mess
It's not, right?
It's very challenging. It's like I haven't done iboga, but I have done combo, which is a frog toxin. And combo is not super popular, and it's still legal in the US because it's just not that popular. It's not popular enough to become a problem necessarily. Or that's one of the reasons. And I imagine iboga is similar because it's just so physically rigorous. I mean, it will, from what I've heard, just flatten you if you take big doses in a physical sense. Not just this is mentally challenging and emotionally challenging. It's physically really hard.
It's really aggressive purging, right? Is that part of it?
That's part of it. Yeah. And I've had some aggressive purging with ayahuasca too.
Red vine.
Yeah. I don't even want to know the details of that.
Do you know where people do the iboga though? Is it therapy centers?
There's clinics.
There are clinics that offer it?
There's clinics. Yeah. There's clinics that I know of for sure in Mexico.
Okay.
A buddy of mine, Dr. Dan Engel, I think he's a medical director of On It. He's got a lot of connections with clinics. I think they have some clinics in Arizona, have some in Mexico. And he's working on some other projects as well to bring that into the forefront a little bit more because it's obviously it works. And I think there's some methodologies around using smaller doses that are becoming popular.
Got it. That's cool. Changing gears a little bit. What do you think of this idea that McKenna has in here these are two ideas. One, that because mushrooms basically grow best or need to grow in cow dung, that might be why we see a certain respect and even religious adoration towards cows in some Eastern religions. Have you heard that theory before?
Yeah, I did. From him. He's the only proponent that I know of it. And again, it's really interesting to consider.
Yeah.
I think there's something rattling around in my subconscious that I read that suggested that kind of religious adoration of an animal has more to do with the geography and the evolutionary need to preserve those animals. So in India, for example, they might have really needed to have access to the milk from cows to meet some caloric demand, and that created a cultural imperative to enshrine a cow for religious purposes. I probably believe the evolutionary argument more than the argument about the psilocybin.
Yeah.
But that doesn't preclude that from still being influential. I mean, if you look at Christian texts, you look at a lot of religious texts, a lot of cultural texts, and there are so many similarities, plausible stories of psychedelics being involved.
Yeah.
Even burning bush.
Yeah.
There's, some people consider Jesus's resurrection to be a psychedelic trip.
Oh.
So he went away, he did some type of, I forget what exactly the psychedelic of the time and region was, and then came out, days later after going into that like deep, psychological place. Even the myth of like Santa Claus is said by some to be something around, the red and the white of Santa is applicable to the mushroom Emerita muscara.
Okay. Yeah.
You'll have to look up especially the pronunciation of it, but the colors, the red and white colors. Mm-hmm. And then the coming in the chimney was like when they would come through igloos in like northern climates in Europe to provide like mushroom trips during the winter. So there's a lot of stories like that. Of course, I butchered that one, but you can look up a ton of these different, what if scenarios, and I have no idea, but psychedelics are so mind altering.
Right.
I cannot imagine a better substance to help humans write down the myths that we feel are important for living life well over the generations.
Well, and there is something to, I think, the idea, and McKenna mentions it in here, that psychedelics are the originators of religion, right? That much of what we have as religions today most likely started as kind of like tribal naturalist beliefs that emerged and morphed over time. Obviously, like the Abrahamic religions are a big shift from everything before them. But even in those, you still see some of the roots, I think, in what would have been kind of like just very personal experiences with these psychedelics. And I think in doing them, you experience many of the same feelings and sense of connection and even visual experiences of some of what you might see in a religious text, right? I know I definitely felt that on DMT, where it was very like, kind of like I don't know how to describe it exactly, but like not talking to God, but in communication with a being that is not of this world, right? And I can see how, especially without our modern science, it would be easy to have those experiences and come back from them and say like, all right, there is something else out there or in here, like somewhere, right? I don't know.
All around us.
McKenna's actually got a great line in the last chapter of the book where he says, God is not an idea. God is a lost continent in the human mind. And I think there is a lot to that. There's something about those experiences that does give you a connection with a lot of different religions, even if you're not particularly religious yourself.
Sure, absolutely. I think, if you look at actually studies from the Harvard Divinity School and some of the research that was comparing mystical experiences, people who were in the divinity school studying religious studies, psychedelics could reliably create mystical experiences, could reliably create these kinds of experiences of connecting to some type of higher power. I know that for myself, I've got two parents that have PhDs. I was raised in a very rational, scientific first upbringing. And it wasn't until a really deep ayahuasca session where I actually felt like asking God for something and asking for his help and guidance, her, whatever it's. And since then have had some type of spiritual relationship with a higher power. And it was a result of the psychedelics for sure. And, many of going back to the religions coming from, relationships with psychedelics, it's really quite interesting when you look at human society and civilization and how agriculture has moved us away from the kind of roots that we evolved in, and how Abrahamic religions came, generally speaking, after agriculture, and how many of the religions in, the Americas, for example, the Aztecs, they didn't always use psilocybin in the best way. I mean, they had ritual sacrifices, human sacrifice on psilocybin, but they considered psilocybin mushrooms, literally the term in Nahuatl, their language, is flesh of the gods. So they had a very strong connection between psychedelics and their own religion, just in the terminology, nomenclature.
Yeah, it's like Well, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned your experience with it too. I mean, coming back from that, how do you, maybe this is a weird question, but when you think about it for yourself, what do you feel like you have a relationship with? Because you use the term higher power, but is that something external? Is that nature? Is it, something within your mind, or is it just something ephemeral that can't really describe?
It's ephemeral. I think if I had to describe it, the most applicable 3 words is I don't know. I would say it's so much of what I grew up with in this ephemeral way of looking at it. So it could be physics and like quantum physics and all kinds of like really hard science based, philosophies.
Yeah.
And that is God. Like these are the universal laws that make the ball go straight to the ground. We call it gravity. That's part of God, whatever. There's so many aspects of, I think, my own psyche that just have had this ephemeral higher power added to it. So like all my beliefs on, like I said, science and evolution and things like that kind of create its own type of definition.
Yeah.
And for me, that's one of the reasons why I know spirituality gets thrown around all over the place as a term, but one of the reasons I like spirituality is because it's very personal to me. I'll never try and convince you of my God.
Right.
And I would never want you to feel compelled to create anything but your own relationship to a higher power. So I find it's a very personal thing, and sometimes I can't really even explain it. I can just feel it, and that's actually one of the most interesting things about doing these really deep multi-experience retreats is I feel like I have far more tools to access a part of that state in my normal conscious waking consciousness. Whether that's just certain breathing techniques or just even a sauna or even fasting, like all these different things put me in a mindset that's close enough to going way the hell out there.
Yeah.
That there's ways that I can actually connect to that higher power without the need for any kind of compounds now.
Do you meditate normally?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Do you get it from that as well, or
No, not really.
no?
When I do Kundalini yoga, I get it. When I do
What is Kundalini yoga?
Kundalini yoga is a type of yoga that's less about asanas, like movements and poses. Sometimes you'll have like repetitive words. You'll just say like HUD, 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 and you'll say that for like 15 minutes.
Huh.
It's pretty trippy. Like you get to places where you're like, you start hearing things, you start saying things that is not HUD. Like it really creates weird interesting kind of psychological phenomena. And then you'll do movements, like repetitive movements. So same thing, you can do like the same movements 20 minutes in a row, just like your arms up and down, up and down. And I think I've gone beyond most people with Kundalini.
Yeah.
In the sense that I've blacked out in one Kundalini.
Really? Like
practice.
You just fainted?
I just fainted.
Jeez.
I was standing up and I just came up and I was like doing the exercise very vigorously, and I was like holding my breath at the top and it just black out. And the next thing I remember, I'm like on the ground and everyone's around me. And,
Jeez.
Are you okay? But that split second of me blacking out, I went somewhere way out there. Like it was like ayahuasca. And yeah, I can do that with Kundalini in general, with sweat lodges, like Native American Muskogee Creek Sweat Lodge that I go to regularly with
Where is
Mentor.
that?
It's out in Wimberley.
Okay.
So
And
Mentor
you can
just invites.
show up and do a sweat lodge, or do you have like a special connection?
Well, I mean, he's a mentor, so like I'm kind of doing like a. I could invite you, but
it'd be hard
kind
for
of
like a random person on the street.
Yeah, I have kind of a it's like 3-year process to do. It's a vision quest.
Oh,
So it's a very long process of mentorship, as with many Native American cultures.
cool.
Yeah. So bringing it back to psychedelics, like for a lot of people who want to go through the lineages of like an ayahuasca shaman, it takes a long time and a lot of work and a lot of
To become
effort
one.
to become one.
Yeah. If you hear about people like going to Peru and doing this stuff, if someone were so inclined to do that, how do they find a good person for it? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah.
Because that would always be my concern is that you're going to show up in Peru and then get like robbed.
Yeah. I think a few things. One, it's a misconception in my judgment that you even need to go to Peru in the first place. Peru is obviously a poorer country, and with tourist money coming there to do ayahuasca, it's brought out, the worst in certain people. And I think in America especially, we have some kind of weird expectations around what a shaman needs to look like. If they're brown and they look indigenous and old, then hey,
It's probably legit.
It must be legit. And that's not true. There's a lot of, people in South America that are, taking advantage of the trend. And, I won't disparage them. These are poor people trying to make a living, and it's just unfortunate.
Yeah.
My recommendation is do things only from referrals if you can.
Yeah.
And if you can get multiple, not just referrals, but multiple opinions on a shaman, all the better. And I've got a lot of relationships with people that I can, if anyone wants to reach out, I can help them, find people in the United States, in South America, Mexico, serving around, But there's some really great people that basically travel from city to city serving medicine. So it's pretty out there. You just need to be tapped into the right circles, and you need to have somebody that you trust who can tell you, yeah, I've worked with these people, or yeah, I know people who have worked with them.
That's not necessarily where you would recommend someone start though, right? Like I feel like I hear about that, people who have not done any psychedelics going straight to ayahuasca, and I haven't done ayahuasca, but I don't know, that idea scares me that somebody with no psychedelic experience is going to go straight to what seems like the biggest thing you would reasonably do. But how do you think about that?
Well, it is true that ayahuasca, it can be more intense. I mean, it just interacts with the emotional centers of the brain in a different way. DMT is quite a different molecule than some of the other, compounds, psilocybin, LSD. But I think facilitation probably has the most to do with it. So if your first attempt is a big dose of psilocybin, or the alternative is whatever the shaman gives you of ayahuasca with a shaman, I would say it's probably best to do it with a shaman.
That makes sense.
And they have an intuition around you're new, what you can handle. And they usually, if you find someone who's, worthwhile, who's studied in a true lineage, they are very intuitive about that. They'll make sure to keep people safe. And, I see where you're going. I see where you're coming from, but there's very few traditional ceremonial kind of psilocybin experiences. I know that they're out there, and there's other ways to facilitate psilocybin, but having done all of them multiple times, ayahuasca is definitely one of the most profound. And so if somebody's really called, I'm going to spend some money, I'm going to really put some effort into this, then I would go with ayahuasca. And the caveat would be anyone who has a similar mindset that you have, trust that. If you feel like psilocybin feels less intense for you and you want to go that route before ayahuasca, totally trust that. That'd be my advice.
Makes sense. You guys were talking about offering a trip at some point, right?
Yeah.
Through Oyasin?
Yeah. I would love to through Oyasin, but what I came to realize is that I couldn't offer anything specifically myself, or I couldn't add any specific value to the psychedelic experience itself. And so I have a number of partners that I just have relationships with, I've worked with, etc., where I just kind of help people, along to, find someone that will work for their schedule, work for their travel budget, et cetera, et cetera. I just basically help people find what they're looking for. I do want to have hunting experiences that include psychedelic experiences, whether it's before the hunt, after the hunt. Obviously, dosing is very risky during the hunt, so I don't think putting anybody on psychedelics during hunting experiences is necessarily a good idea, but I could totally see how psychedelics or altered, states of consciousness before hunting experiences could be really valuable, because that's what completely changed my perspective on a lot of things over the last year, is kind of having them in a close proximity, just inadvertently in my life.
Right.
So I want to create that for other people as well.
Cool. Well, if people want to get updates on what you're up to and find you online, where should they go?
Sure, they can visit oyasin.io, which is oyasin.io, and that's just the lifestyle brand that I'm working on. And that's probably the best place, is just reach out to me through there. And
what about you? You're not really on Twitter?
I'm not on Twitter at all.
I'm on anymore.
Not on Twitter at all.
Are you on Instagram?
I'm on Instagram. You can find me at MANSAL Denton, or honestly, if you want to send me an email, if you're interested in you're interested in being put in touch with someone about these experiences, MANSAL at oyasin, oyasin.io.
All right. Well, hopefully we just blow up that email inbox. But yeah, Mansal, thanks for coming on, doing this episode. I liked that we got to do a lot more talking about personal experiences and stuff as it relates to the book. I think it's fun. And obviously, if anybody wants to reach out to me too, my handle is just at NATELISON on Twitter. But yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in for this episode. We're getting everything back on track, so definitely let me know what you thought of the book and the episode. And as always, if you're enjoying the show, we appreciate you leaving us a review on iTunes or letting any of your friends know about it. I think we survived this hiatus because of word of mouth. So thank you to everyone who's been sharing the show. And Mansal, thanks again. And maybe we'll do a future episode on hunting or something as well.
Absolutely. Sounds fun. Thanks for having me, buddy.
See you all next time.